This is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America. On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, we talk to prominent US citizens, not just about their country's past and present, but also about its future. What, I ask my American guests, will be the 21st century fate of their now venerable republic? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Keen on America, a show associated with the mainstream Keen on show, in which I talk to prominent Americans about their lives and their identities as Americans. Today we have an interesting guest. Many of you will be familiar with him. He has quite a lot of visibility. His name is R. Derek Black. He has a new book out, The Klansman's Son. He's famous as being a scion of perhaps America's most distinguished or notorious racist family, and he's joining us from Baltimore. Derek, how would you introduce yourself as an American?
I think primarily I think about the fact that I was born into probably one of the leading families of the white nationalist movement in America. I think about myself secondarily, oddly, as having grown up in Florida. It's only been in retrospect that I've recognized just how much growing up in South Florida and my great-great-grandparents moved there in 1908 has affected my perspective on the world. And I guess I also think of myself as someone who engaged in that world and went to college in that world, and eventually changed my mind about believing the ideology I was born into.
Does that make you an American, as somebody who is self-made or self-invented, someone certainly who rebelled against what they inherited from their family?
There's two ways that I think about answering this. One is I feel like I'm always having to emphasize how this movement that I was born into, it's very American, but it's also international, and they think of themselves as international. And so in a lot of ways, I grew up with this explicit message about being not American. I remember in a strange sort of third culture way on 9/11, I was 11 or 12 years old. I was already homeschooled, and I remember waking up and seeing it on the news, and my dad was telling child me, adolescent me, about it, and he used the phrase that they had been attacked, that this country had been attacked, and that things were really going to change. And he perceived it as we were sort of outside of it. I think one of the things he was relieved by is that before that, the Oklahoma City bombing had been the most horrific terrorist attack on American soil in years, and that was one perpetrated by white supremacists and by a part of the movement that he represented. And so 9/11 was something that he knew was going to take some of that attention off it. So I guess to answer your question about feeling American, I felt so many different ways about that, and it is impossible for me to escape the fact that that outsiderness that my family felt and the sense of wanting to almost overthrow the country made the particular kind of Americanness that I inherited feel, I guess, both deeply nationalistic and also very anti-patriotic.
Yeah, and to remind our viewers, your father is Don Black, who was, is he still a grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, or?
No, he stepped down a few years before I was born in the 1980s. It wasn't an ideological change. It was because the branding of the Klan wasn't working. It was something that people thought of exclusively as violent and uneducated, and he wanted to cultivate something that would have more political success.
Coming back to the idea of rebellion, Jefferson, of course, who is the quintessential American, although not everyone likes him, spoke of I can't remember the exact quote, Derek, you'd probably be able to remind us, but the tree of liberty being nourished by the blood of patriots, the need for rebellion. Do you think that's true about America, that given its foundations and its rebellion, or what some people see as a revolution against colonialism, that need for rebellion has always been a central feature of its culture and of its citizens, of people like yourself?
I'm not sure how to answer that. Like, partly thinking about my own answer, I really hope that revolution does not happen. And even in saying that, I think about how much I am affected by the circumstances of my birth. That my dad quoted that line a lot. People around me quoted that line a lot.
The Jefferson line
The
about
Jefferson line. They also quoted his very explicit white supremacist lines about advocating for America to be this exclusively white nation. Like, they saw Jefferson as being a progenitor, a founder of their white supremacist movement. Like, they wanted to explicitly follow in his footsteps, and they saw themselves as justified by him including in their revolutionary goals. And there's no distinction in the far right white supremacist, white nationalist movement between the more legitimate political goals, which really is the strain that I lived in. Before I was born, my dad tried to overthrow the government of Dominica as part of a mercenary army of Klansmen. But also my godfather, I was called uncle growing up, who was my mom's first husband and my sister's dad, David Duke, had famously won office the same year I was born. And those two threads always felt different to me, the idea of bloody revolution and the idea of winning politics and overthrowing and really changing the government. It was only in retrospect that I was able to sort of understand what felt so challenging to me when I was a kid, which was that there's no line between them in this movement. It's something that the same ideology drives people, and what makes someone land on this idea that they can win through politics, or that the only way is through terrorism and violence and fear, is sort of how optimistic they are about the American political system. And that's not something that, neither of them are democratic. Neither of them are focused on any sort of broad consensus. They're all focused on this idea that they've inherited fundamentally a white supremacist state more than they've inherited any sort of ideological, constitutional, or democratic one.
You mentioned David Duke. He was your godfather. Is he still your godfather?
It's hard to say. Godfather was a word that I almost regretted using just now. It's the media had used it before.
Yeah. But you never called him Don Corleone, I hope.
Yeah, it's more like we're not Catholics, or didn't really grow up Christians, and so I always called him Uncle. He called himself Uncle. He was a very
Uncle David.
Yeah, very, very important, close family relation, and a really important adult figure when I was growing up.
Was he
and also
nice
my parents'
guy?
Closest friend.
Was he a nice guy? I mean, leaving aside the politics, I guess it's like asking about whether Hitler was a nice guy. He was nice to animals and children. Was David Duke nice to you and your pets when you were growing up?
He could be very kind. Yeah, he could be very generous. When I was a teenager, I started traveling to Europe because he invited me to, and he was already living there. He was at the time trying to avoid being in the U.S., but put me up and showed me the world and talked to me about my future, and was pretty open about some of his defeats and guilt and some of the things he didn't like. But I think in other ways, I wouldn't call him somebody who I would have ever picked as a friend, because he was never open to being contradicted. He wasn't somebody who was open to the idea that he might be wrong, or sort of having that cognitive dissonance about the idea that other people might have a lot of things to teach him. He had this real sense that he had things to teach other people, and the moment that you contradicted him or really thought he was wrong on even sort of small things, he wouldn't get angry about it, but he would become very defensive and pushy about it. And he's a hard person to talk to while being charismatic at the same time. I kind of wonder, he's the most famous demagogic politician I've ever known, and I sort of wonder how much that's an archetype.
Was your father, or is your father like that, or was he more open to discussion?
He was much more open to discussion, and I think it's also telling. My dad's goal, they met when they were teenagers, They met sort of at one of the founding eras of this movement, and white nationalism is a movement. White nationalism or white power. There's only tens of thousands of people involved in it. It's different from racism. It's not just like every person who has a racist idea is a white nationalist. It's more of a cohesive movement. And they met when they were teenagers in the 1960s, and they were best friends and closest allies for over all of those decades. They still are. And David's outgoingness, David's very public glad handing, and the way that he wanted to be seen by other people and the way he wanted to project himself, it was different. His personality was different from my dad, who my dad was much more interested in having kind of private conversations and close, loyal relationships, and being somebody who could be, I guess, almost even like a center point of the movement itself, whereas David wanted to be somebody who went out into the world and was almost like the spokesperson for it.
You mentioned Duke, and when his name comes up, he's often described as a neo-Nazi. One of the things, he lives, as you say, in Europe. He has lots of connections with the right-wing racist movements, radical right movements in Europe. Do you think he is or was comfortable with the idea of neo-Nazi for an American nationalist? Isn't that a contradiction in terms to be associated with German nationalism? Or perhaps is this white nationalist movement of men like Duke and your father, is it internationalist in an odd kind of way?
It's deeply internationalist. There's sort of discussion among people who do anti-racist research about the history of this movement, and there's pushback. I always want to note this about the idea of white nationalism. That was, I use that phrase in the book because it was what my dad identified with. It was the one that he put on the banner of the first website, the first white power website that was ever founded, which was his. It was what he called his community, and I think it's a good identifier. But there's some people who argue that nationalism sort of sounds like patriotic, like it's about America or the UK or Germany or France. And when they use the word nationalism, the nation they mean is the white race, and they have no sense that there is any geographical political entity or nation that should ever supersede that. And they're very comfortable, including my dad, are very comfortable with abolishing the Constitution and abolishing the federal government and abolishing borders and carving up North America into smaller countries, if that's a way that they could create a racial state. I think it's significant and important for people to recognize when they say white nationalists, they are never, ever talking about loyalty to a government.
So they're not American nationalists, at least in your view.
No, I mean, in their own view, they would be, sometimes I think maybe they will parrot ideas. They are ideologues who admire a lot of American history. And I think, like I said earlier, they quote Thomas Jefferson and will quote some of the founding fathers and the very explicit racist opinions that they had, these very like explicitly white supremacist opinions. Thomas Jefferson had ideas that I don't think it's illegitimate for them to say are indistinguishable from some of the white nationalist ideas. Like he wanted the American Colonization Society to immigrate all free black people out of the country. Like he had this idea of racial segregation on a national level. And so they see, if anything, they see themselves as the sort of true ideologues of American history and people who should prevail. And if they were to prevail and were to create an entirely new country, that they would be upholding this sort of strain of racist thought. And I should also say they don't use the word racist, they'll use the word racialist, that is carried over throughout all this time. They see themselves as being the only people who understand this part of American history and are willing to argue that it's not anti-human, that it is not wicked, that it is not something that is going to destroy the people of this country. They argue that they're the people who uphold this like true ideology.
So I'm guessing they would be, if they came on the show, they would be sympathetic to European political leaders like Meloni, Le Pen, Orban.
I mean, there's a lot of overlap between even the explicit political parties. I mean, I grew up in some of the more gentrified parts of the white nationalist movement, where we had Bruno Gollnisch and other representatives of the Front National and close associates of Le Pen who were coming and speaking at explicit white nationalist rallies in the early 2000s. It's rare to find a complete impermeable or a non-permeable barrier between what people would identify as the sort of far right, beyond the realm of acceptable politics white nationalist movement, and far right nationalist parties in Europe or the United States. There's always passing back and forth of people, and especially ideas.
One of the Americans who's most associated with now with the internationalist far right is Steve Bannon. Spends a lot of time in Europe, very prominent American Catholic. Given the history of the Klan and with its foundations in anti-Catholicism, for you, you're doing still a doctorate at the University of Chicago, so you're a professional historian. What do you make of the history of the Klan in terms of race and religion? And what did your father make of it? Did he understand that it began in many ways as being perhaps more hostile to Catholics than it was even to African Americans?
No, they were aware of it. They were trying to create a new image of the Klan. They were trying to create a version of the Klan that incorporated whiteness in all its forms, and so explicitly they were pro-Catholic. David got into a lot of flack after he had left the Klan and was running for office in Louisiana because there was so many of his white constituents were Catholic. He had to be very clear he had never been anti-Catholic, and it's true. It wasn't a subterfuge. He really did not join the Klan because he was anti-Catholic. Their vision of the Klan was one that it was white nationalist. It was one that incorporated ideas from the Nazis, because they had both started by going to Nazi rallies outside of Washington, D.C., and they were trying to bring this sort of message that they found in Hitler and tie it into American history. I think the goal of their Klan in the 1960s and 1970s, which was just one Klan, there's no trademark on calling somebody the Klan, which is why they also eventually stopped calling themselves the Klan, because they didn't want to be associated with just everybody in the world. At least that's what they said. But their idea was to take this thread of American history that a lot of people in the US considered exclusively American, and thread it in and tie it into these more international ideas of white power that you see in Nazism. And if you really want to go even further back than that, there's a lot of overlap in ideas that the Nazis took from American white supremacists, like ideas around eugenics, or ideas around blood laws and anti-miscegenation laws, are things that they explicitly tried to model on American laws. And so this is something that's gone back and forth for many decades. And I think the only other thing I would say is, as a person who studies history, was not something that I understood at the time, but as a person who studies history, I really have the firm opinion that specifically racism, the idea of white power and white supremacy, we know that it does not have scientific backing, but white nationalists like to pretend it does. They like to believe it does themselves. I was taught by these sort of tenured professors that race was biological, and it was part of my unlearning to see that there's just no argument for that. But they could never have come to these arguments. Like, generations of people would not have come to these segregationist arguments had there not been an initial legal hierarchy set up because of slavery. And I think that's something that we often miss. There's this idea that people's bigotry or their biases or their hatred of other people comes first, and then they start imposing segregation and discrimination and anti-blackness and all these other forms of discrimination and racism. But it's really, if we want to look at it in a long array of a few centuries, but even within a lifetime, it's because society did get set up this way for reasons that were mostly economic, that people start justifying the racism, start saying that, if the world is this way, then there must be a reason for it, and build up all these ideologies. And I think that that's something we get backwards too much, and I always try to make that point.
Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Isabel Wilkerson and the new movie, based on her book Caste really makes that point.
Yeah.
What about you talk about the science of racism. Did your father and your godfather, David Duke, did they or do they treat race as a kind of metaphor? Because it's increasingly clear that in scientific terms, most Americans are of mixed race. There was a huge amount of mixed race during slavery, after slavery, and when people do their genetic tests, they usually find that there's no pure whiteness or blackness in America. Did they recognize that, and did they treat race, or do they treat race as a kind of as a metaphor, as a narrative in itself, a kind of almost an anti-scientific narrative?
I No, they genuinely believe that race is the most fundamental distinction between humanity, and they work really hard to ignore all the contradictions and the counterfactuals and the fact that fundamentally there is no way to define race other than as a social category. There's legal race, there's black people and white people and how everybody gets classified, and it's based on phenotypes because you had a bunch of different immigrant groups in America, and they were distinguished and sort of looked different based on their origin. But white nationalists work very hard to convince themselves that they have scientific backing for it, that they're not just people who have these sort of feelings, that they are not just people who don't like certain kinds of people, or they really try very hard to believe that they are not advocating for something that is social or economic, or if anti-racist policy, they explicitly will say that if it were true, that if they believed it were true that anti-racist policies would make an equal society, if people had no hierarchy, if like white people, if they didn't believe white people were better and more intelligent and more creative than other people, and that that was a real biological category, then they would feel morally compelled to advocate for anti-racism if they thought that was true. And the only reason that they feel they can't is because they actually have all this evidence that race is biological, and IQ tests are tied to race. And it's remarkable because it's very easy, and we have a century of robust literature, and there is just no definition. There's no genetic definition of race. There's nothing to tie races together the way that they categorize them. There's human groupings in the world, but race is not it. And so they have to work so hard to it, and I think that really tells you something about the problems of trying to balance this as a morality. It's like whenever you have an ideology that decides who's in and who's out, the kinds of people who go into this movement are actually people who see themselves as having a very rigid moral calculus. They're not people who are okay with gray areas. They're people who really want to feel like they're doing the right thing, and they look around at a society that's clearly deeply unequal, and their choice was to say that they weren't comfortable with the idea that this was just some random social chance, that they were born into a legal category of person that gets advantages, and they may have been born into a body of some other person who got disadvantaged. They were only able to live their lives if they worked incredibly hard to convince themselves that the world as it was around them had a reason to it. It was they had more wealth in general because they were a smarter kind of person. And I think that really tells you a lot about this movement.
Final question before I want to take a break and get to the book, Derek. There are many different peoples in the non-white category. Black, brown people, Jews, and so on. You don't need me to tell you this or list them. For many people in America, the movement that your father and Duke and others are part of is essentially against African Americans. It's not really against anyone except the blacks. Is there any truth to that, or is it more complicated?
I mean, I feel like things are always more complicated than they seem on the surface. Anti-blackness is just a foundational, fundamental part of white nationalism. It's, if you want to look at it historically, the category of black came before the category of white. Like the idea of white as this legal social category was only created in opposition to the idea of blackness and these justifications for lifetime enslavement and inheritable enslavement. Just trying, it was an economic system that was created and categorized people for economic reasons. And then the people who were not being disadvantaged were the ones who were the opposite of the color black. Like that is the origin story of this whole idea of whiteness. And so I definitely don't want to say, oh, white nationalism is something that is not fundamentally based in just hatred and foundational ideas of blackness as being the opposite of what they are, all the bad things when they're all the good things. But in reality, as a political movement, no, it's a movement that is foundationally based in anti-Semitism. I don't think it would even exist if it didn't have the idea that it is not people of color around the world who are organizing anti-racist movements, but it's actually Jewish people who are secretly manipulating them all. Like if they didn't have that belief system, none of their worldview would make sense. And they are foundationally against immigration into the United States from Central America, from South America. They're against the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship. I think to understand the nuances of how they look around at the world and try to define everything by race, you really need to see all of these different facets, and also at the same time recognize how fungible the idea of whiteness is. Like somebody being white was very different in the 19th century than it is in the 20th century, and yet they tried to pretend like it's a consistent category.
It's of course ironic that your last name, Derek, I'm sure I'm not the first person to tell you this, is black. You are the author of an important and a very interesting new book, The Klansman's Son, My Journey from White Nationalism to Anti-Racism by R. Derek Black. I want to remind everyone that very interesting guests like Derek Black are brought to us because of our friends at Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics. Going to run a short feature about Liberties. Then I want to come back with Derek Black and talk specifically about the book as an act of rebellion and what he was trying to do in it. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back with R. Derek Black in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
We are back with R. Derek Black, the author of The Klansman's Son. Derek, was this book an act primarily of rebellion? Or is this book an act of rebellion?
It's an interesting question. I condemned my family's ideology a little over a decade ago. While I was writing it, I was going through all the 10-year anniversaries of all these experiences, and I was writing the chapter about publishing a public letter condemning my family's beliefs and saying that I was breaking with them on the 10-year anniversary of doing it. And so in a lot of ways, it's an act of trying to understand where I came from and also to really strongly push back. But I spent years after that thinking I just didn't have anything that was even moral to say. I felt like I didn't just grow up in this movement. I fully believed it. I was speaking publicly about it on TV when I was 10 years old. I started a kids webpage. I personally believed it wasn't some kind of act or I didn't see it as some way to like appease my parents. I felt like I had a lot of undoing to do, and I felt like I had caused a lot of damage. And it was almost 4 years after I condemned my family that I spoke at all publicly, and that was because of how many overlaps I saw between the Donald Trump movement and explicit white nationalists. I felt like I had an obligation to at least do some explaining of what this thing looked like from the inside. And so now when I've gotten to this point, I turned down writing a book for years. I didn't want to, not to be too self-aggrandizing about it. It was that I just didn't understand how to write it. And I changed my mind on January 6th. It was in 2021, watching the Capitol insurrection and seeing once again, just like Charlottesville, the overlap between the white nationalist movement as this like revolutionary movement and mainstream politics, which is always how they've seen themselves. And that was the moment when I started really advocating that I'd really like to write this, and I felt good about the fact that I did, and I do see myself as standing in some kind of breach, some kind of way, and trying to do a little bit more than yelling stop, trying to be actually somebody who I can look back on a pivotal moment and feel like I did what I could, that I was on the right side of things.
Yeah, and you're the subject of a book by Eli Sasler, or Washington Post, very distinguished Washington Post writer. He's been on the show, not about the book he wrote about you, Rising Out of Hatred, The Awakening of a Former White Nationalist, but a book that came out in 2018 and did very well. It has over 2,000 ratings on Amazon. What did you learn about yourself in writing this book that you didn't know before starting?
I grew up with this maxim that you should never, my dad told me explicitly, you should never write down or say anything that you are not comfortable with the idea of it appearing in the New York Times the next day. And the implication of that was, don't have a private life. Do not try to work things out with people. Like, you are your message. And so when I went into this, I thought that it was going to be very hard to capture a life growing up in this, because I didn't keep journals when I was a kid. I was afraid of them leaking. I was worried about things I said on the internet when I was 13 being published in the newspaper. Like, it actually happened. I had to deal with that. But what I was surprised about, what I feel like I learned about myself, was I tried to answer that by going through all the old newspaper clippings, going through old TV shows, not just in my own life, but my dad back to the 1960s and 70s, to try to understand just who we were and what it was that I grew up in. And I was really surprised to find how personal it felt a lot of the time. I didn't realize until I was trying to go back and understand what it meant to be such a public family for so many years, that he was teaching me how to try to express myself in a way that it was safe for it to appear in the New York Times, because we were actually talking to a New York Times reporter. Like, a lot of our interviews feel like we were going back and forth, sort of dueling each other or arguing with each other in the press, even when we were on the same side. And it was remarkable kind of to recognize that he had lived a private life in a very public way, and he had taught me to do the same thing. And so it felt like I was able to capture what it felt like to be living that life in ways that were just meticulously archived, were available in university library archives all over the world.
He sounds like a loving father, and the book, which you include your father in the title, essentially The Klansman's Son, might be seen as an act of hatred. Do you hate your father now?
No, I definitely don't hate him. I mean, I love him, and it's challenging. When I wrote a public letter, it was the end of this experience over years at a liberal arts college, where people confronted me and I knew them, and I felt like I had to at least engage, and lost the evidence, lost the arguments, lost the fight, and had to speak out. But when I did it, I didn't warn him. I didn't let him know I had been his right hand. I'd been the only person who knew the passwords to the white nationalist community that he ran online, which is the largest white nationalist website in the world. I was trying to help him throughout my adolescence to carry this movement forward. He was always worried that it was going to come to nothing, that he had wasted his life. And I believed that he was a good man. I believed that he was deeply moral. I believed that I knew that he was doing what he felt was right. And I was convinced he must be right at the time. And we were very close in condemning it, coming out and saying that this is unethical. I have to push back against it. Was something that was so hard, not because it was like hard to accept factually. Like, in retrospect, that was kind of easy. Just to be open to facts was something I was proud of. But doing something that would break his heart, that would make him feel like I had abandoned him, that would make him feel like I had condemned him, that I was joining the chorus of people who called him a hater, was something that was just unbearable. And I still to this day, really appreciate that he chose in that week of really hard conversations. I was in a different part of the state, and at one point he said he wished that I had never been born, and then called back a few minutes later and said he apologized and rethought that, and he was just hurting so much. But asserted that like we need to maintain a relationship. It's not, we couldn't imagine a world going forward where we couldn't talk at all. And it's been really important. We don't talk a lot. We don't. We talk on holidays and birthdays and sort of text every now and then. I don't think I've ever had a conversation with him when he did not bring up how baffled he is that I left this movement and that I don't believe it. But that relationship, the fact that it continued, is something that is one of the more important things in my life.
Did you have, or do you have, brothers and sisters?
I have two older sisters. They're David Duke's daughters, so we have different dads.
And were you the favored son, or was it because you were a son that he gave you all these responsibilities?
Well, I mean, I was his only child, and so I was the child he was raising. He also had me relatively late in life. He was in his 40s. Both of my parents were in their 40s when I was born. I don't think they expected me either. It was a later marriage too. They had both had previous marriages and they had known each other since they were in college, though. And so when I was born, I think I don't always know exactly what it was like at that time, but it was a complicated relationship because David and my dad are very like best friends, and it was something I'm sure they had to work out at the time, that this relationship was changing. But it felt like I could get close to him. Like I wanted to be close to him. I really respected him. I admired the fact that he did these media interviews. And I was 10 years old, and so I cannot at all condone his idea that asking me, "Oh, are you sure you want to do international media?" Is asking consent, because I was 10 years old, and I can imagine I'm getting close to, in a few years, the age he was when I was growing up. And well, I guess not quite, I'm like a decade from now, but like getting there. And I can't imagine asking that child, are you good with this? And even though I felt confident about it, accepting that as an answer and thinking I understood the consequences of it, but it always felt like, and I think his view of it was that he was not trying to push something on me. He wasn't trying to tell me what I had to do or what I had to say. He would leave the room when I would give interviews. He always wanted to make sure that it didn't feel like he was looming over me or trying to give me a talking point. He told me he wanted me to think for myself. He told me that what he valued from me was the fact that I had ideas that he didn't have, that I saw the world in a different way, that I was more open to things than he was, and that he hoped I could help find a new way forward. And I was so proud of that. I was so proud of the idea that something that he had spent decades trying to build and was the pride of his life, but also something that he was worried had been a waste of his life, that was something that I could join him at that point and help and find a way forward. It was something that just felt so meaningful. And it wasn't just that relationship, it was the whole community, because white nationalism is a movement that has tens of thousands of people. So growing up, my babysitters were white nationalists. My friends were the kids of white nationalists. My parents' friends were white nationalists, and they all had these stories going back decades. And having them respect me and think that I was someone who was really worthy of their admiration was just so fulfilling and affirming. And it was something that, looking back on, I feel a lot of sympathy for myself, but also, realize it was really hard to realize in the end that leaving that movement wasn't one about ideology. It was one about losing all those relationships and that sense of community and tie.
We've talked a lot about your father, your uncle, your godfather, yourself. Not a lot of conversation so far. I know there's some in the book about women, your mother, your sisters. Is there a gendered quality to this movement? And there obviously is. You've chosen to drop the he and be known as they. You've embraced a post-gendered future personally. What's the gendered element here, the aspect of men and women and the white nationalist movement in the United States?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the white nationalist movement is deeply gendered, but I think there's a misconception people have that it's exclusively a movement of men, because that's often what they see. When people see clips of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, or clips of some of the white nationalist groups that showed up on January 6th, they tend to see men and they assume, this is just a movement of angry men. But from the inside, it's a movement where women are essential to running things. They tend to not be the spokespeople because of essentially sexism. Sometimes they're mad about it. I knew many women in leadership roles in white nationalist organizations and in white nationalist media who were resentful about the fact that they were being asked to not be a public spokesperson because there was this idea that it wouldn't look right. It wouldn't look right to have women who should be more demure out there yelling about immigration. And some of them didn't care at all, and just did it anyway. But if you were actually in the midst of it, you recognize that it was women who were doing all the organizing. It was women who planned the events. It was women who made sure that the catering got there so that everybody would have food. It was women who did the editing of the newspapers and the magazines. It was women who were honestly the ones who were coming up with a lot of the ideas. I can't imagine either my dad or David Duke's political lives going how they had without my mother being somebody who behind the scenes was always talking with them about, here's a way that I think you might want to frame this. When you're giving that campaign speech, there's something that was in the news, and I think this is something that would really sort of move the audience. And that's not an unusual role that women play, is these sort of insightful people who are a little less full of themselves and often a little less egotistical, and are therefore, in my experience, able to see things a little bit more clearly sometimes. And so, I think to say it's a sexist movement is absolutely true, but to dismiss the fact that it is deeply, deeply run through and organizing couldn't exist without women who are some of the most ardent ideologues within white nationalism, I think that really would be missing a lot of how this all works.
Although I'm guessing that feminists, women who don't want to have kids, wouldn't be particularly welcome in the movement.
Not usually, no. There's an enormous amount of criticism from, which sort of plays out in that message about how women shouldn't be the spokespeople, they shouldn't be the leaders, because they think the reason it looks bad is because, well, they should be having kids, they should be homemakers. And while women in white nationalism often uphold that, they just kind of try to do it both. They spend their time trying to help organize, and they spend their time trying to run these things, and they don't want to give the wrong image, and they see themselves usually not against their will as wanting to uphold this idea of a homemaker, while rarely actually playing the role that I think I would expect of some demure person who never has an opinion or never says what she thinks should happen. It was really my sister who kind of taught me about feminism when I was first growing up. She also believed in white nationalism, and she was older than me. She was about a decade older than me. And I was a little kid. I remember talking to her and her complaining about how in any rational world, our mother would get the credit as one of the fundamental people who helped this movement go forward, who was essential to a lot of the ideas, who was essential to sort of planning things. And yet, because they're misogynists, they're not giving her that credit, and she didn't want it. But I remember my sister as a teenager being really indignant about the idea that they would dismiss her contributions because they didn't think women should be seen that way.
Did you see the movie Zone of Interest?
No, I haven't seen it yet.
Because it's an interesting representation of women. I wonder, I want to end in a second. I know you got to run, Derek, but if your father or David Duke, if they saw a movie like Zone of Interest, which is about the mass murder, industrial murder of Jews in the Third Reich, would they just deny it? Well, what's their attitude towards the Holocaust? Do they deny it?
Yeah, they do. They explicitly deny the Holocaust. Earlier I was talking about how ludicrous it is that they try to rest their case on the idea that race is a biological thing, that Jews are not white, like all these ideas that are inherently easily disprovable. We have a lot of evidence for this, and the Holocaust is a historical example that was an early domino for me to fall, because they're adamant about Holocaust denial. They're adamant that people were not systematically murdered, and yet the documentation from the Nazi regime is so thorough and so clear and so available that for me it was something that was early a difficult thing to maintain and sort of led to dismissing anti-Semitism within the movement before I was ever willing to dismiss the racism. Uh, and I think so. I think there's actually valuable lessons to even understand how they see the world. That if your ideology has to be based on something that people socially have a lot of evidence to argue against, and you have to dismiss it, you have to work really hard to counter all the mainstream evidence and to not pay much attention to it yourself, then clearly there's something going on that you don't want to accept. And with Holocaust denial, the answer is because the Nazi regime is the closest to the government that a white nationalist wants to uphold, and yet they don't want to be seen as people who are installing a government that systematically murdered millions of people. They can't accept both of those things, and so they just decide that they're not going to believe it.
Yeah, it's an odd way of revealing morality. Finally, Derek, you note that you wrote your memoir. Is that the right way to call it, a memoir, The Klansman's Son, or an
Yeah.
autobiography?
When I first started writing it, I was trying. I started writing it as something that I thought was going to be a bunch of essays sort of on politics and persuasion and this experience where I dramatically changed my mind about something, and I came away from it realizing that facts and argument were essential. They were very important. That's how I saw myself, and I really did need to engage with better facts. But ultimately our ideologies are based in our communities and who we see ourselves connected to. And I saw it as that book. I wrote it that way. The first year I actually wrote it as a bunch of essays, and it's more of a memoir than I actually expected it to be. It's more chronological and more tells the story of my family before I was born, and then the experience that I had of growing up in it and ultimately coming to condemn it, and finally had it explained to me the difference between a memoir and an autobiography is that this memoir isn't trying to just explain my life. It's trying to use the examples that I have experienced to try to make an argument, try to make a case for the way that the lessons I've learned. And so that's really what I hope people take from it, is just what my experiences can tell us about how to do things a little differently.
Yeah, it's a warning, as you suggested earlier. We haven't talked about Trump, and I want to finish with this question. Trump these days, some people think he's a criminal, people think he's a clown. I think he's a rather clownish criminal. You mentioned January 6th and the insurrection then. How seriously, Derek, should we take the threat of white nationalism in America? Was it the defining force in January 6th? Are they a significant part of the support for Trump and indeed of the Republican Party? And indeed, if Trump is reelected in November, might men like your father and David Duke essentially be in power or have access to power, political power in America?
It's complicated, and it's changed a lot since the first election in 2016. I actually had a lot of reassurance from the fact that, for the most part, it wasn't explicit white nationalists that came into office in 2016. It felt like it was ideas. It was a movement that had spent decades trying to come up with talking points that would be more palatable to people, and that it felt like that was what had come into power. But over time, over the years, that opinion has changed for me. I think now I view it as much more of an explicit threat, in the way that the Trump movement has become much more militaristic, much more open to violence, much more open to revolution. And that is the foundational part of white nationalism that I didn't see in this movement a few years ago, that I think is really a threat now. I think the last thing I'd say about it is that white nationalism, it's not right to think of it as an army underground that's just waiting to march in the streets. It's not like that. It's a small number of people, genuinely a small number of people. So about thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands of people, who show up at meetings and have been involved in this for years and have a strategy and a theory of change. But the way that they influence things, the way they see themselves as influencing things, is this idea of concentric circles, that they uphold the center. They publish the newsletters, they spread the memes, they constantly drive the message. And it's the next layer out who maybe doesn't feel it quite so ardently, who now you're in the hundreds of thousands of people. It's the next layer out beyond that who engage with the material, who respond to these ideas that they hold in a more subtle way, and they get amped up and brought into a more extreme ideology. And they've seen themselves this way for decades. It's not ever been about trying to have an explicit political takeover. It's always been about trying to co-opt other movements and make it much more explicitly racial, much more explicitly anti-Semitic. And I think I can't see any moment in recent decades that has ever been more in line with that goal and the sort of explicitly racist revolutionary goals they have than the Trump movement at this moment. So I don't want to make any apocalyptic predictions or anything. I think, I have no idea what's going to happen, but the threads of this movement are more active and more being more well received within the Trump movement this time around than they definitely were the first time.
Well, finally, Derek, what's the best way to fight this? Because I'm guessing, well, you obviously are not a white nationalist, and I'm assuming that the vast majority of our audience isn't. I'm not, and we're all fearful, I think, of the future that you're warning us about. How do we make sure it doesn't happen?
There's no simple answer. And I think the general one that I try to give, the one that I thought about this for a long time myself, like my own personal life was, I feel like I did actual damage. I spread ideas that have led to violence, and I can never quite pinpoint the ways that I am responsible in those ways. It's this sort of nebulous stochastic terrorism, but the ideas that I outspread cause direct harm to people. And I had to think for years about, what is it that I do, if anything, that can ever, do I stop doing anything? And that was not the right answer. That was a cowardly answer. And I don't think it should be anyone's answer. And trying to decide what could I do, the answer was something. And I think everybody has a different point of connection. Like, you are running your show. Every listener has, at the very least, individual relationships with people, and not abdicating a responsibility to the society and the community around us. That is, while not a specific answer, because you have to be talking to a specific person, it is taking that role seriously. And I try to do that, and I end up in conversations like this. I end up doing work in doing history education with people around really tough stuff and how we've gotten here. And I think everybody has some different point of contact like that.
And of course, America will be 250 years old in 2026. Will you be celebrating in a couple of years, Derek?
I will. I think probably ever since I moved to Baltimore, I've felt more connected to American colonial history than I ever have. I grew up in Florida, and it almost felt like some kind of outlier pioneer thing, like Alaska or Texas or something. But now that I live in Baltimore, it's, the Constitutional Congress was based here for a while, and they had to flee New York. And it feels like everywhere I turn, I can see that colonial history around me, and it affects my life in a more built environment way than it ever has. So I recognize how important it is to my life, and I don't dismiss it. I don't think that it's something that any of us could or really should dismiss as being unimportant to what happens next.
Well, our Derek Black, the author of The Klansman's Son, thank you so much for appearing on Keen on America.
Thanks, Andrew. It's good to be here.